victory for Vice President Harris runs through Pennsylvania. And former President Trump has to win North Carolina to return to the White House. Yet polls show the two candidates to be in a virtual heat in one and very close to each other in the other. We are fortunate today in being joined by 4 expert observers who can help us make sense of the political climate in both states and be better analysts ourselves of the data that will be coming our way in the final weeks of the campaign. Our first panelist is Michael Nutter. Between 2008 and 2016, Mayor Nutter was the 98th mayor of Philadelphia, the largest city in Pennsylvania, and the 6th largest population in the country. In 2012 and through 2013, he was the president of the United States Conference of Mayors. He is currently the very popular David N. Dinkins Professor of Professional Practice in Urban and Public Affairs here at SIPA, Columbia. Berwood Yost is the director of the Center for Opinion Research and the Floyd Institute for Public Policy at Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He also directs the Franklin and Marshall College poll, which tracks public attitudes towards public policy issues and political campaigns. Mr. Yost's scholarship has attempted to identify ideological and partisan patterns among Pennsylvania's voters. Caitlin Legacki is a public affairs expert, a graduate of UNC Chapel Hill with a career spanning nearly 2 decades in the public and private sectors. She served as the comms director for the House Majority PAC in 2020, then became senior advisor for strategic communications to the United States Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo. She now runs Caitlin Legacki Communications. For 30 years, María Teresa Kumar has led Voto Latino as its president and CEO. Voto Latino is the largest Latino youth advocacy organization in our nation. In the 2020 election, Voto Latino announced that it had registered 601,000 voters. In September of this year, El País has noted that North Carolina is one of 5 states where Voto Latino has had the most registration activity this cycle. Ms. Kumar is also an MSNBC political commentator. I have asked each of the panelists to present 4 minutes of commentary on the current state of the race in either Pennsylvania or North Carolina or both. Before I turn to the panelists, I wish to invite you to send questions to the chat, and we hope to get to some of them later in this webinar. I will turn first to Berwood Yost to start with a discussion of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Tim, and good afternoon. I'm going to have a few slides to share with the audience today. And I'd like to address basically 2 broad topics, what I think we know and what we really don't know at this point. So I'll start with what we know. Point 1, Biden's departure has lifted Democrats, but his presidency still looms. Second, the state's political environment certainly favors Republicans. And third, Republicans are underperforming statewide. Let me show you some data. First, on Biden's departure. This particular slide shows you the first term job approval ratings of governors and presidents in Pennsylvania since 2000. The black bars and dots represents those governors and presidential candidates who won the state in their efforts at re-election. The gray dots in line shows you the trajectory of the job approval ratings for those who didn't win. And the red shows us Biden's approval ratings through his first term in this state. Very clearly, President Biden was headed towards defeat in this state, given where his job approval ratings are. That leads us to our second point about the political environment. If we go to the next slide, many folks feel really negatively about their personal finances. I've highlighted 2 times for you, 2 time periods. One is October 2020 2020, right before the last election in Pennsylvania, and the far right is a slide that shows our September poll. You can see in October of 2020, more people felt good about their finances than felt bad about them. That is not the case today. And in fact, if we look at the next slide, at a number of different indicators that we track, favorability of the candidates, personal finances, net job approval of the candidates, of the incumbent president, you can see that the numbers for Democrats are really negative here. President Biden's job approval rating is -28. That's the worst since we've seen in the first Bush administration or the second Bush administration. Personal finances are -32. People really feeling bad about their how they are doing financially. This is again a hangover. I think part of the reason that Biden is rated so poorly is because how people view their personal finances, and this is also why they think about Trump's time in office with a bit of nostalgia because they felt like they were better off. So clearly these numbers, and actually even Trump's favorability ratings have improved over time in the state, as you can see from that column on the right. So that takes us to their underperformance, though. Even though all of these indicators, if we look at the next slide, even though all of these indicators suggest that the environment favors Republicans, Kamala Harris, in our first two polls since she entered the race in August and September, had a slight advantage. These bars show us the point estimate and the sample error for both of the candidates. And so she has a lead. If you look at the polling in the aggregate, she probably has about a 1-point lead in this state. And so clearly Republicans are underperforming. But let me talk about the last things I want to talk about, what we don't know. Next slide shows us that basically we don't know what issues will matter the most. We're not sure about how ticket splitting, factionalism, or the role of third-party candidates are going to play. And we still don't know what's going to be more important. The context I just described are the candidates. Let's talk about issues. If you look at the issues that people say are most important to them, the economy comes out on top if you ask what's the most important problem. But if you ask them why they're supporting a candidate for Senate or for president, remember we have a Senate race in this state, the arrangement of issues are very different. And things like abortion rights or immigration become more pronounced, and even partisanship becomes more pronounced. The second thing I want to tell you is about factionalism. And if you look at the next slide, you're going to see how the different factions within each party are supporting the candidates slightly differently. So for instance, those traditional Republicans, even though they might say they're currently voting for Trump, if you look at those purple bars, you can see that some of them say they still might change their minds before Election Day. And so this is a real, Harris is really trying to spotlight those voters. Independent voters are somewhat in the same boat. But between the two of them, that's really where the advantage lies in Pennsylvania. And finally, just a note about ticket splitting, there isn't much. You can see that there are almost no Harris-McCormick voters. Only 2% of the voters in our last poll were supporting Trump and Casey. And so there isn't going to be much ticket splitting. I think the real gold is to be found in those independent voters and perhaps some of those traditional Republicans who are still thinking about their decision. That, in a nutshell, is what we're seeing. Sorry for moving so fast, but I only had 4 minutes.
All right, thank you. You did great, did well, and we'll be able in the second round to allow you to elaborate on a few of those points. I'd like to ask Caitlin if she wouldn't mind going next.
Hi, thank you for having me. I am thrilled and excited to be here today talking about North Carolina. I think it's the most interesting state in the country. I think it is ground zero for a lot of political excitement this year. Historically, North Carolina is a fairly moderate state. For about 20 years, North Carolina Democrats have been arguing that demographics are destiny in the state. There's been a huge influx of both migrant populations, but also Northerners moving down to to North Carolina, whether it's for jobs or just quality of life reasons. But it's a state that's constantly changing. And as many of you know, in 2020, North Carolina was the state that Joe Biden lost by the narrowest amount. So meaning it was the last state that Trump won, the first state Joe Biden lost. And I think, one of the things that those of us who enjoy North Carolina politics are watching this year is not just the presidential, where Kamala Harris is making a huge push, but also the effect of the down ballot races on the top of the ticket. I think this is a unique situation, both because of the governor's race, but then also the state superintendent of education race, where the local politics are really driving a lot of the enthusiasm and the turnout that will either benefit Harris or harm Trump. And so that's a really unique dynamic that is driving a lot of activity in the state. But then also, I would just mention that part of what makes North Carolina interesting and challenging is that it is effectively 3 different states in one state. The furthest west point out in the mountains is further west than Detroit. And obviously, North Carolina goes all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. So there are real cultural differences across the state that are going to allow us to really focus from both a political basis and an issue basis in distinct areas and on issues. But it's also really expensive. There are 13 media markets in North Carolina that require campaigns to really invest both time, energy, and resources to be successful there. And so part of the reason we're excited as Democrats about North Carolina is because we've got the campaign apparatus up and running. We are making the appropriate investments there. And meanwhile, you've got relatively weak or extreme Republican candidates, both at the federal level, but also at the statewide level, that are really driving a lot of enthusiasm for Democrats. So I'm excited to be here and talk about it. And Tim, thank you for having me, and I'll hand back a little bit of my time.
Thank you, Caitlin. I'd now like to ask Maria Teresa, please, to join the conversation.
Hi, Timothy. Thank you so much for having Voto Latino in the conversation. For folks who may not be aware, but Voto Latino, we focus not only on voter registration and voter education, but a large part of it increasingly since 2014 with the gutting of the Voting Rights Act of Eric Holder versus Shelby County the previous year, we started doing more voter education and also suing different states. The most one that we recently won was in Texas, but before that, it was actually in North Carolina. And part of the reason that we saw a lot of this shift in voter suppressions was because of something that Caitlin mentioned, is that there is such a demographic shift right now happening in North Carolina that instead of vying for folks' votes through policy, the fastest way for folks, it seems, is to prevent them from voting until they figure out this new population. And so one of the things that we are doing now as we're getting into the election is polling, because I do think that there is different sensibilities of who the Latino community is, but without a real granular understanding that while it is true that Latinos are not a monolith, our experience in where we grow up, meaning if we're growing up in Northern California versus in North Carolina, we are politicized vastly different based on the people who are passing legislative laws. In the case of both Pennsylvania and North Carolina, their commonality was that there was a wave of not just anti-voting laws, but there was also a wave of anti-immigrant laws. And it was at a time when we were seeing a rise in the Latino population, not by immigration, but quite literally by births, by American citizens turning 18 and becoming newly eligible. To date, Voto Latino, just on this cycle, we've already registered over 8,000 Pennsylvanians, and in North Carolina, we've registered 21,000 North Carolinians. For folks who are keeping track, those are often margins of victory in different states. Let me share with you a little bit of the latest polls that we have, because I think you will find this interesting. I did. But then again, I like polling. One of the things I will share with you, let me see if this works. Here, tell me if you guys can see my screen. Can you see my screen?
No, not yet.
Okay, let me see. Let me go back. 1 second, please. I should be better versed in this at this point, but my apologies. Oh, shoot, I just had it. 1 second, please.
No problem.
So as I scroll through this, one of the things that really makes our polling different oftentimes from other folks is that we are very much in the business of practitioners. We actually do our polling trying to figure out what's going to make, what is the voter hearing? Where are they on the fence? If they're on the fence, why are they on the fence? So we really try to dig into people's consumption of information, who influences them, and at the end of the day, what are their priorities? And oftentimes, what they're hearing from different candidates, oftentimes, not shockingly, I suppose, doesn't always align with what the candidates are actually saying. And so, as an example, we just did a focus group with some young men in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and in Arizona. And one of the young men basically said that there's no chance that he was interested in voting for Kamala Harris. We went then fast forward, and we actually did a poll of identifying the different issues that the candidates were talking about. And it was interesting because the same young man who said he was not interested in voting for Kamala Harris, partially because she was a woman, when they started talking about the poll about a $6,000 tax credit for your first child, he was all in. When we started talking about a $25,000 loan forgiveness for your first home, he was all in. And so this really shows that the balkanization of information, of where people receive their information, whether it's on, normally it was usually on, 3 news channels. Now it's TikTok and CNN and Fox and MSNBC, if you're lucky. These young people are receiving primarily their information from TikTok. And so the news that they're receiving about politicians is very distorted from what's actually the policies that many of these folks would, under all circumstances, they would actually espouse. And I apologize. I was hoping to get this up and running, but apparently it's not coming up. So I will speak a little bit to what we were seeing. But for example, when folks are saying that Latinos are very much switching to the Republican Party, one of the things we found is that it was, again, based on experience. The biggest shift that we're seeing is in the right leaning is in places like California, where original show me your paper laws are a distant past. But in a place like North Carolina, where there has been friction for new immigrant communities, that is something that's very much top of mind for them. In Pennsylvania, depending if you're in Philadelphia compared to if you're in Allentown, you're also seeing grand shifts, because the younger the community is in certain places, the more susceptible they are to anti-immigrant legislation, anti-immigrant rhetoric. And so what we found that was surprising to me, which was I was hoping to show you more broadly, is that in a place like North Carolina, we're seeing actually a shift of young Latinos going more for Kamala Harris than they did under Biden. And we're seeing a shift of more Latinos in Pennsylvania going for Kamala Harris than under Biden. And conversely, we're seeing a diminishing support of Kamala Harris compared to Biden in a place like Nevada. And we're right now trying to figure out what is those shifting environments. One of the things that, that one of the other panelists mentioned was this whole idea of housing and finances. Those are absolutely what's driving even young Latino voters 18 to 29. And when we talk about housing and affordability, what we found, it was not just about, are they able to make rent, but are they able to make rent based on balancing their checkbooks?
Thank you, Maria Teresa. By the way, if you want, you could send that slide to Mariana, and we'll make it possible in round 2 for you to call it up.
Terrific, thank you.
Mayor, last but not least, Mayor Nutter, Professor Nutter, the floor is yours.
Let me not get you're on mute admonishment. I did figure that out. Tim and the rest of the team, apologize for being late. I teach today. My train was late coming out of Philly, so I'm just going to be late all day long. But nonetheless, excited to be here. Not in any kind of highbrow way, but I think ultimately most people are going to come to some level of agreement that this election more than likely gets decided in Pennsylvania. And the closeness of the race, when you look at the candidates, the amount of time that they are spending in and around Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, a number of other places in Pennsylvania, it is, and Tim will correct me where I might be wrong, it is highly difficult to become president of the United States of America without winning Pennsylvania. And so the stakes are very, very high. The polling, every poll that I've seen shows it either very close, a toss-up, 2 points here, 2 points there. And we know in this world, in this work, 2 points don't really mean anything unless you actually win by 2 points. Then it means everything. So I think what you want to look for in Philadelphia, this is all about turnout. Some of us are old enough to remember efforts that were made to elect Wilson Goode, first African-American mayor in Philadelphia 40 years ago. That was an all-out effort. If you were breathing and anywhere on the street of Philadelphia, in a bar, in a barbershop, in the supermarket, somebody was coming to drag you out of wherever you were to make sure that you got to the polls. And we'll need that similar kind of effort this time around, pretty much the same as 2008 with then Senator Barack Obama. And so it is my general view that Vice President Harris needs to walk out of Philadelphia with a net 600,000 vote margin to offset what's going on in other parts of the Commonwealth. Secretary Clinton won, I think, if not all 4 of the surrounding counties, Bucks, Chester, Delaware, Montgomery counties, in 2016. But unfortunately, even with those wins, the margin was not enough to take her over the top with a 44,000 vote difference between Secretary Clinton and Donald Trump. When you break that out of 44,000 votes, 67 counties, how many polling divisions, you're literally talking about, 2 or 3 votes per division all across the Commonwealth, and it's a different race in 2016. Center County, which is also in the area of Penn State, obviously large population there, Erie, Pittsburgh, and parts of the Southwest. You generally really only have to win about 11 counties out of the 67 in Pennsylvania to win the race, but you need to roll up very large numbers. And so this is turnout, especially in Philadelphia and many other parts of the Commonwealth. This race is tremendously close. We unfortunately may not know, similar to 2020, we may not know on election night who has actually won, but there are some signs to point to when you get down to it, and it's going to be close.
Thank you, Michael.
Back my 5 seconds.
You yield back your 5 seconds to the chair. Berwood, let's pick up on something that Michael just mentioned. Let's talk about those 11 counties. What's the split like currently in those 11 counties? And is Vice President Harris doing as well as President Biden did than Vice President Biden in 2020 in those 11 counties?
Well, that's, I think, going to be the key. And in 2020, Biden actually won 13 counties of the state's 67. He won them by about an average margin of 15%. And those counties represent about 55 to 57% of the state's registered voters. So that's where the votes are. I think Mayor Nutter is absolutely correct. You've got to run up big margins in those areas. Those areas are predominantly the Southeast, the Lehigh Valley, Center County, and of course, Pittsburgh. If you can roll up big numbers there, I think, that's where this election is going to turn for Harris. In fact, there's some charts that I've prepared about the different counties and the trends in their voting patterns over the past 6 elections or so. And I've highlighted some different types of counties. as Mayor Nutter said, you see Philadelphia is highlighted there, sort of towards the bottom. 80-some% of the vote in Philly needs to go to the Democrats for them to win. You've got counties like Fayette County in the western part of the state that just have gone from strong Democratic counties to strong Republican counties. You want to cut into the margins there. If you're Harris, you want to keep them up if you're Trump. And of course, the swing counties, Northampton County, everybody talks about Erie County, and I think that's a place to look. But I also think Northampton County is very interesting. It is one of those parts in the state that has a larger Hispanic population.
Which county is that? Which county is that?
That was Northampton County.
What's the major town of or city?
In Northampton, Bethlehem, I think, is in that community. And then the one place though I'm really looking right now is Berks County. If I'm looking anywhere on election night, I'm looking at the margins out of Philly. I'm looking at Northampton County, and then I'm looking at Berks County. Berks County has relatively high Hispanic population for Pennsylvania. It is the one county that Trump only won by less than 10%. He won it by 8%. And so if there are issues with Hispanic voters in this state, we're going to see that show up in the margins in Berks County. It's likely a county that Trump will win, but if he wins it by less than last time, I think that's a good signal for the Harris campaign. And so that is one of those places I'm thinking about.
Thank you. Maria Teresa, it's a natural segue to you. I believe we've got the chart to show everyone. I hope
Yes, let me share this with you all.
And then perhaps you can talk about Berks County and Northampton County before we talk about North Carolina again. Here we go.
So yeah, so here, this is basically, let me see, can everybody see this chart?
Yes, they should be able to.
Okay, so basically we saw, like I said, mentioned earlier, there was a slip in Nevada and Wisconsin. Texas is surprisingly more competitive, but to the states that we're talking about in North Carolina and Pennsylvania, you'll see in North Carolina, 57% of the Latino voted for Biden. As of October, our polling actually is showing her at 67% among the Latino community. That's a massive shift. And in elections that are marginal and are won by every vote counts, Latinos, while not huge in North Carolina, they make up 5% of that electoral base. When you lump them in with Asian Americans that make it up closer to 4%, you're talking about 9%. In shifts in population and potential. The reason that's important is that I remind folks that in Virginia, that's when Virginia starts shifting. When Latinos came around 5% and the Asian population came around 9%, they formed a bit of a block with the African-American community, and it was enough to push the state in a different direction. That is what we're actively seeing in a place like North Carolina and Pennsylvania. Now look at Pennsylvania. You were talking a little bit about the shifts and the population influx that we've seen in the last couple of years. For us, what was really interesting is that he's gone the vote in 2020, the vote for Biden was 69. Right now, Harris is at 77. It's actually in Pennsylvania that they have done the most work. And I do have to do all that hat tipping off to the unions. They have been an incredible ground game in Pennsylvania that they're finally reaping the benefits, but that they've been laying down the work since 2020. And so one of the things that we're looking at very, very closely is the accessibility of participation and whether or not the folks in North Carolina, if they vote, will it count? Of all the states, if you were to ask me which is the state that has done the best job in voter suppression, it has been North Carolina. It's going to be the toughest one, I think, to beat, and it's going to have to be by overwhelming voters at the polls. I saw a question here, Timothy, of someone saying, what can we do? Vote early and encourage people to vote early. Because when you make a plan to vote and you vote early, then that's when the media starts talking about this and great enthusiasm for voters. And believe it or not, we are humans that like to do what other people do like to do as well. So if you vote early and media starts covering that people are voting early in places like North Carolina and Pennsylvania, then what we're going to see is actually people receiving FOMO, fear of missing out, and they too will vote. We've actually been able to do studies to track that. So that's what we encourage folks to do. October 29th is officially vote early day. Please do so, mark your calendars, and encourage others to do so.
Thank you, Maria Teresa. Caitlin, talking about the 3 states in North Carolina, how might the hurricane affect the western state of North Carolina?
Yeah, I think that is one of the biggest unanswered questions of this election cycle right now. Typically, Democrats rely on Asheville in Buncombe County for a huge block of votes. But there's also these scarlet, ruby red mountain counties around Asheville, where part of the success that Donald Trump has had, Republican Senate candidates have had, is not only turning out voters, but juicing turnout beyond their usual levels. And so the hurricane in North Carolina has hit both of those pockets of voters pretty significantly. On the one hand, Asheville is still without running water. Like the schools are not open. Things are quite bad there simply because of the geography. So even the most capable hurricane relief efforts cannot build roads overnight. So that I think is a real, challenge, and it's something that Democrats are keeping an eye on. The question for Republicans is whether in those collar counties, whether there are people displaced, whether they are going to turn out at the same record levels that Trump usually gets them to turn out at, or if they're satisfied with the type of, hurricane response that they're getting, does that kind of turn down the temperature and make them less enthusiastic about voting? I think these are all questions that we don't know the answers to. And frankly, I don't know that we will know the answers until after the election, simply because of how much of a live issue the recovery efforts are. I know both the Democrats and the Republicans are doing everything they can to make sure their voters turn out, but it really is a pretty shocking and remarkable kind of event that has happened in that western state of North Carolina.
Thank you, Caitlin. Michael, when we talk about turnout in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, I'm reminded of the intervention that former President Barack Obama made last week, directed at solely Black men.
Mm-hmm.
To what extent are we seeing in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania generally, this internal conversation in the Black community between men and women over the issue of supporting Vice President Harris?
Well, clearly there's not enough conversation going on because, I would say this very broadly and as a very, very proud Black guy. What the Black men need to be doing is talking to Black women. They need to be talking to their grandmother. They need to be talking to their mom, their sister, niece, young people. The absolute strongest, and this is not just, it's not solely because of Vice President Harris, although she is certainly deserving. I mean, the most consistent block of voters on the Democratic side are Black women, who just figure stuff out and understand ultimately self-interest. And so, having said that, we as a Democrat, as Democrats, we have to take some responsibility for the, I don't know if it's disaffection, lack of attention, you're not speaking to my issues, with Black men, with African-American men of color. And lastly, I'd have to say, you just can't escape. We should not try to act like at a certain level, there are not things, I don't want to put labels on people, but, I think I read a comment attributed to some young African-American who just said, I don't have any experience with a woman being in charge. Like, really? I've had Black women in charge of me all my life. What are you talking about? So, I think in Philadelphia, we need to better utilize the voice and the presence of our newly elected Black woman mayor, first ever woman mayor of Philadelphia, who's a Black woman, Mayor Sherelle Parker, who campaigned in a way that actually attracted that same constituency just last year in 2023. So there are voices out there, and I think there's a need for a larger collective effort to make sure we're talking to a lot of different constituencies and with very strong direct messages.
Thank you, Michael. Berwood, in this next round, I wanted to ask you about ticket splitting and try to help us understand, as you're trying to understand, the nature of the differences between the support for Senator Casey and for Vice President Harris.
Yeah, there isn't a lot of ticket splitting, as I demonstrated earlier. And one of the things that we've kind of pointed out is that we expected as election day got closer that we would see less of it, that people who had felt comfortable about Bob Casey as their senator, he's a known commodity. His father was governor of this state. He's been in elective office here for years and years. It's a really respected brand in this state, if you want to put it that way. And he was really cruising, and it looked like his opponent, Republican Dave McCormick, had just not had a tremendous amount of support from Republican voters. That has started to shift. And so we're seeing a smaller gap than we saw just a month or two ago. And so that race has gotten closer. The presidential race has remained close from the start. But at one point, Bobby Casey had probably a 10-point, 8-point lead. He's never had a race that he's won by less than 10 points in running for Senate. And so that race is really tight. He seems to be running ahead, though, of McCormick, and his advantage is larger than Harris's is. So at the end of the day, there will be independents and there will be some Republicans who are voting for Trump Casey. I don't think we'll see many Harris McCormick voters just because of their motivations and their preferences. So if there's 7% of the electorate splitting their tickets, I'd be surprised if it's much bigger than that between those two races. It's probably going to be smaller. And the other question we don't know is how much roll-off is there? In 2020, the presidential race had the most votes cast, but down ballot races had fewer and fewer votes cast for them. And so I can actually envision if someone asked me, should we count split ticket voters as ones who don't vote for the same candidate, not just casting for another candidate, but for not voting? And I think we will see a number of Trump voters who will not vote for McCormick. Some of them have told us they view him as a rhino. So whether that's true or not, I think split ticket voting will probably be very small, as it has been in recent elections.
I think it's also going to be useful for viewers and for our conversation for you to mention something about how registration numbers have changed.
Yes.
In the state.
Yeah. So in 2008 and 2009, Democrats had about a 1.2 million voter registration advantage in the state. Since 2000, Democrats have really dominated the top tier races for Senate, for governor, for president. They've won about 70% of those races. So Democrats had a huge advantage. That 1.2 million voter registration advantage from a decade or so ago is down to probably 200,000 votes, 200,000 voters. So Democrats still have a voter registration advantage, but it is much smaller than it was. The question is, what does that mean? And how will that translate into voter preferences? In some instances, it's just voter registration catching up to past behaviors. And in some instances, it's a reaction to the unpopularity of the Biden administration. But there certainly has been a big shift. And we're keeping a close eye on that to see what it means.
Thank you, Berwood. Caitlin, I think something else is happening in North Carolina. Aren't Democratic registrations going up, or are Republicans registering a lot?
Yeah, so it's a good question without a simple answer. Effectively, we're seeing dramatic increases in voter registration. But the Democratic advantage over Republicans in 2024 is about a third of what it was in 2020. Meaning right now it's about 130,000 more Democrats than Republicans. But we're also seeing significant increases among unaffiliated voters, especially young people. So the people who are most likely to vote for a Democrat, they're just registering as unaffiliated because both of the national parties have terrible brands in North Carolina. So I think, you know, it's hard to know exactly how that will affect it. I agree with Berwood that part of it is just the registration numbers catching up with voting trends. And it also it reflects the idea that young people or new voters don't have the same party loyalty that our parents and grandparents once had. So I think Democrats feel good about turnout. I think they know exactly which counties they need to really focus on GOTV efforts. For example, Charlotte, which is in Mecklenburg County, is kind of ground zero for low voter turnout. It's one of the biggest counties in the state, but it has the 5th lowest turnout in the state. So there's going to be concerted efforts both to get people to the polls, but also, as you know, María Teresa's group is doing, trying to get those voters registered and out of the polls as well.
Thank you, Caitlin. María Teresa, are we seeing among young Latino voters that they're registering as unaffiliated or independent voters in a larger number than they were before?
So I think this is a generational thing. Absolutely. And, you know, oftentimes we like to talk about Democrats and Republicans, but if we were to level with everybody, then the largest political party in this country are independents, right? They're independents that lean Republican, or they're independents that lean Democratic. And so one of the things that we are at Voto Latino, we register disproportionately those independents, but it's because it's a generational piece. There is a distrust of party. But what gets them activated and moving to the polls, they're issue-based. If anything, I would actually consider them far more sophisticated because they want policies that work for them. And so the moment that you start talking about not only climate change and abortion care and gun reform, you get them to pay attention. But to give you an idea of where we are within the Latino community, for example, if we were to look at Pennsylvania, for them to make a real mark, we need roughly a 5% increase in Latino participation. That would mean roughly them casting 53,000 votes. Of those 53,000, based on the math that we're doing, 40,000 would go to Kamala Harris. In North Carolina, increasing their participation by 5%, that would be 17,000 more Latinos casting a ballot than the last time. Of that 17,000, roughly 11,200 would go to Harris. Again, based on their proclivities of where they're saying which candidates are for them. And I do think that this is where we have to just have broader conversations on how do we make sure that candidates are talking and speaking to people's language, not English or Spanish, but in the issues that they care about. And that's where the opportunity is for these candidates right now.
Thank you very much, María Teresa. Before we go to Q&A, it's a little bit of a lightning round. I'm thinking about it's the night of November 5th. And I want each of you to tell me what you're going to be looking for in these two states. I'll start with you, Michael. What are you looking at? Is it a county? Is it a turnout number? What is it you're going to be looking for to help you predict what the outcome will be?
Definitely, absolutely want to see turnout, but also notwithstanding our inability to count early ballots early. What a concept. You know, at least the machine numbers, which are going to be generally the overwhelming numbers. What I saw in 2016, standing in the Javits Center, I knew that we were in trouble because Pennsylvania reported so late. Put aside what was counted, not counted, whatever. we need an early count certainly out of Philly. We'll get that because of the machines and the technology. I want to see percentage turnout, sheer number, net vote for Vice President Harris, and then I want to see what happened in the Philly suburbs. That'll tell us what's going to happen that night.
What kind of numbers you're looking for in the Philly suburbs? For Kamala, for Trump to win, what percentage does he need in those Philly suburbs?
If Trump keeps Vice President Harris under 60 across those four, we've got, what's the line in the movie Houston? We have a problem.
Okay. Berwood, what are you going to be looking for?
Well, most of the same things the mayor has said, but I'm actually interested in the number of mail ballots, keeping a close eye on that. On election night 2020, I looked at the mail ballot returns and pretty much knew what was going to happen. So I'm looking at the number of return mail ballots. Those will heavily favor Democrats and be an indicator, I think, of their turnout efforts, in addition to the other things the mayor's mentioned. And as I said earlier, I'll also be looking at Northampton County returns and probably Berks County returns where Reading's located, just to get a sense of how a competitive area is doing and how an area with a lot of minority voters is doing.
Caitlin, what are you going to be looking for?
So many things. We're going to be looking for, Republican turnout in those mountain counties to see if it's depressed at all. I'm going to be watching turnout in Mecklenburg to see if they can bring up those numbers a bit, because historically Charlotte is an area that is inclined to vote for either a normal Republican or a normal Democrat. And so I think that'll benefit Kamala Harris. And then I think another big thing that I'm going to be watching is how much Harris can keep up with Josh Stein and whether there's a significant gap there, because Josh Stein right now is running about 12 points ahead of Mark Robinson. And if she can at least keep that close, especially in the big counties like Wake County, Durham, Forsyth, and Mecklenburg, I think she'll be okay.
Maria Teresa, thank you. Maria Teresa, what are you going to be looking for?
You stole all my thunder. I would say ditto on everything, but I do think that when Michael was talking about the Javits Center, the moment that they called North Carolina, I knew that she had not won. And it was at 8 o'clock. I think it was like right before 8 o'clock, right? I was in the studio at MSNBC and I was like, and people were like, how's it looking? And I couldn't say anything, but I'm like, it's done. I do think though, one of our indicators of enthusiasm for her are going to be overall, how many young people have registered. And we're tabulating that right now, because that will be an indicator of what is the threshold based on last time that you have new eligibility of voters, folks to vote that were not eligible last time.
And North Carolina call at 8 o'clock was literally when I turned off my TV, and my mom was like, why are you turning it off? Things are just starting. And I was like, it's over.
It's over. See, Caitlin, we're aligned.
Okay, we're going to turn to the question and answer portion of our webinar. And I'm going to start with, this is someone's question. This is not my language. But it's a good question. What are the factors making this election so close in these two states when it should not be close at all, given the two candidates? Mm-hmm. And go ahead, not in any particular order.
So I want to go back to something that Berwood said, Berwood, I'm sorry, I apologize. Maybe 2 questions ago, it made mention of the quote unquote unpopularity of the Biden administration, which for me has just been one of the most frustrating aspects of this whole thing. The fact of the matter is that the Biden-Harris administrations passed more bipartisan legislation that has brought the country back from the depths of COVID-19, the worldwide pandemic, a whole bunch of other stuff. Now, two wars that technically we have nothing to do with, but stuff happens on your watch, and so somehow, when you have a flaming bag of dog mess on your porch, suddenly it is your problem, right? So, and so I think again, we being Democrats, I mean, we've just had the worst messaging ever. I mean, there's more money flowing than I think possibly at any time since Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I mean, someone has to be getting some benefit somewhere out of something. Yet no one seems to know anybody that benefited from anything. If you have stock, whatever your thing is, 42,000, this is up, that's up, lowest level of unemployment, since Moses. I mean, it's just, it's insane that all this stuff is going on for which they have gotten virtually no credit and no one knows. Like, how is that possible? And so that's a part of, so you have that. And then you just have, there's a cult. I mean, we just have to call it for what it is, right? And the whole idea of, fake news. One of my colleagues here mentioned, young people are getting most of their news from TikTok. Like, really? Can we find Walter Cronkite? I mean, seriously. I mean, TikTok is the source of information. Right? I mean, maybe a recipe or something. But so, I mean, for all the TikTokers out there, no disrespect, but I mean, it's just, it's message, and messengers of what's really going on. And when the truth and facts have been so blurred that I think people just can't figure it out. And they're just kind of pissed off about everything. All the attacks on migrants, this whole othering. The reason you don't have is because of somebody else. The reason you don't have is because of somebody else, and somebody else. And, like this narrative that some migrants are taking, black jobs and Hispanic jobs. And I was trying to figure out what a black job was. And I mean, it's just like all this word salad and stuff and no pushback. Anyway, so I'm going to get off of that soapbox, but it's so confusing.
María Teresa, before we go to María Teresa, the New York Times had some polls about this question of othering, and the surprising effect that it has on some Latina voters. Can you give us some insight into how and why some second-generation Americans would actually be more comfortable with tighter immigration policies?
So I think Michael hit it the nail on the head, is that we oftentimes have really short-term memories of the impact that the Trump policies had on our communities. I had this very conversation, and for folks that basically say, well, I'm second or third, mass deportation would never impact me. That's not really what we're talking about. One of the reasons that we've been able to mobilize folks in places like Colorado back in, with someone that was third generation was that those local officials passed anti-immigration laws. And all of a sudden, I'll never forget, a young man, his name was Michael Cardoza, called Voto Latino wanting to volunteer because he didn't realize he was Mexican until he went to buy something and the person behind the counter asked for his papers. And so that is this idea that they're othering everybody else, but not me, not recognizing that his dog whistle is not necessarily a National Guard enforcement. It's literally encouraging the folks that follow him to unleash white nativism against everybody who's not white. And that's that simple, right? Because the question often is like, well, can he really implement mass deportation? It's not if he would officially do it. All he has to do is say the dog whistle, and people do follow what he says. And so I do think that there is this lack of media coverage on what mass deportation would mean. And as a result, people feel like they are not impacted by it, because that alone should be a disqualifier for being president of the United States.
Berwood, I cut you off. I didn't mean to. I'm sorry. You wanted to say something on the last point, or maybe this point.
No, I'm all of the comments are interesting. I mean, I just wanted to comment on the mayor, what the mayor had to say. And I look at this through, a nonpartisan lens. And I take sort of people at the word that they I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. For some reason, I think the mayor's right about maybe why, but for some reason, many people just feel like their circumstances are worse than they were, and they're nostalgic for a time when they thought they were doing better. And Biden and the Biden administration gets a lot of blame for that. I mean, when you look at it from not if it's true or false, but contextually what people are saying, that environment favors Republicans. And I mean, that's the truth of it. And so it's actually, when I look at the data, a bit surprising to me that the race is so close. And I think that speaks to my first point about, does the context win, which means concerns about the economy and nostalgia for a past that maybe didn't exist, but people think it did, or is it people looking at the issues the way they've just been described and thinking about the candidates and what they really offer? That's, to me, the balance that we're looking at here.
Which is why you're saying that Republicans are currently underperforming in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Notice the statistic you had where President Biden is more unpopular now than President Trump was in 2020 at this point in the election?
Yes, correct.
Caitlin, you're a master of, thank you, of communications.
Yeah.
Try to help explain why the election is so close. North Carolina.
North Carolina has so much going for it that if you're talking about the government or politics, something has gone very wrong. Like, we would always rather be talking about basketball. We would be rather talking about business. There's so much else to focus on. And part of that is because it's a great state, but also it is so big and it's so diverse that it is hard for really anything to break through there. It's common, if you look at the approval ratings of statewide officials in North Carolina, they've got a third approval, a third disapproval, and a third don't know. And it's just really, really hard to drive any sort of narrative, to break through, to build coalitions. And it's a moderate state. They want moderate Republicans and they want moderate Democrats, and they don't want to spend their time talking about politics. So that is why I'm excited. I think that this election really lends itself to the Democratic ticket in North Carolina right now. It's still going to be hard. It's going to be very close. But a lot of the balls have been bouncing our way. And so I'm really hopeful that this is the year we finally pull this out.
I can't imagine a better panel and a more substantive discussion about the two states that are likely to determine this election. Although everyone should vote, and we should encourage everyone to vote wherever they live, because every vote matters, makes you part of the outcome. And by the way, the House and the Senate are still in play. I want to thank Maria Teresa, Michael, Berwood, and Caitlin for giving us your time today. And I want to thank all of you for taking time to learn more about two states that I hope you visited, but perhaps you've never even visited, but are going to matter a lot to the future of the United States. And even if you're not American, you probably care about what goes on in this country. Please follow our social media. When I say we, I mean the Institute of Global Politics. And we will have other events about the 2024 presidential election in the weeks to come. Thank you again for your attention. Thank you all for your professionalism. I wish you all a great day, and goodbye to all of you out in the virtual world of learning and discussion.